All right, you will note here where the fluorine has just been introduced that there is a distinct stimulation of all the cells as they react to the poison. This we take to be a defense mechanism. Then things begin to slow up and reproduction is definitely inhibited. Here we have another demonstration of the destruction of cells by a perfusion of 1 part in 30 million. Notice the swelling of the mitochondria in the body of the cells. Notice the compaction of the material in the center or vital spot, which we call the nucleus of the cells. That too is evidence of injury. Note the swelling of the membranes around the cells. This makes it impossible for them to absorb foodstuff. Note they're shriveling up now. There are no cells dividing. All is becoming still. Most of the cells are dead or dying. This demonstrates the toxicity of this material. In summary, I wish to make it very clear again that this film, which you have just seen, is a graphic record of what we and Drs. Berry and Trillwood have seen in our cultures when they were perfused with dilute solutions of sodium fluoride. This film itself is presented here only to show that mammalian cells in tissue cultures can be and are damaged by fluorides, and some even killed when their contact with sodium fluoride is in the concentration of 1 part in 30 million. And we do have photographic records showing almost the same thing in 1 part in 60 million. Poisonous sodium fluoride in these concentrations may not be toxic enough to kill the cells or to destroy an organ or possibly the individual himself. Nevertheless, in human bodies, such poisons are subtle, insidious, and if prolonged over months and years, as in this case where fluoridated water is being used, chronic disorders and upsets of function in 1 or more of the vital organs may ensue. Outward manifestations of such toxic effects may not be apparent at the time to the victim or to his physician. But the constant drinking of fluoridated water may bring about a gradual accumulation of damaged and scarred tissue in the various organs, resulting in the production of many vague complaints in some or in nearly all parts of the body. This makes it most difficult for the physician to diagnose unless one is very alert to the effects of fluoridated water and its consumption. To sum up all this, then, one is forced to conclude that the safety of fluoridation has not yet been proved. The experiments that you have just seen cast most serious doubt on the safety of fluoridation. We feel compelled to agree with the Congressional Committee on Food and Drugs and Chemicals, who, after extensive investigations under the Honorable James J. Delaney of New York, way back some years ago, 1952, questioned the safety of fluoridation and urged caution. And above all, they emphasized the need for more research, even before anyone would consider fluoridation. To all this, we most heartily do agree. The proponents of fluoridation have not produced this research. The safety of fluoridation still needs to be proved. And we who have made this film from over 24,000 photographs in continuity under the microscope at intervals of exactly 39 seconds between each film, bring you this demonstration of toxic effects of fluoridation. We have only begun our research into the effects of drinking fluoridated water. We ask for your support.
So now that we've established, and it's admitted by the National Science Foundation study, which was recently completed, that fluoridating water does not reduce cavities. There's no modern evidence whatsoever that fluoridating water reduces cavities at all. So you have to ask the question, well, why are you still fluoridating water? Now, European countries have caught on very quickly. None of them fluoridate their water. Britain fluoridates about 60% of its water, and it forced fluoridation on Ireland. But the mainland European countries do not fluoridate water, do not allow it. But the United States, we still have the federal government and in collusion with the American Dental Association going to various cities, even small cities, using their pressure, their money, taxpayer money, to try to force local city councils to fluoridate the water. In the state of California, in fact, they've ordered the fluoridation of all waters in every city and village over 10,000 inhabitants, whether they vote to not fluoridate their water or not. So you have to ask the question, well, now that scientifically we've proven that fluoridating water has no effect on reducing cavities, why is the federal government spending so much money and effort to force fluoridation of the rest of the water supply? And even insisting that bottled water be fluoridated, that no one would have access to unfluoridated water except the elite. Well, if we look at the scientific studies on what is the effect of fluoridation, well, we know fluoridating water through a number of studies, some of which were ordered by the federal government itself in the earlier days, increases cancer risk. Burke and Yamin, two scientists, did one of the largest cancer studies in relationship to fluoridating water supply. They looked at all cities, 10 cities in the eastern part of the United States. And they showed that in fluoridated cities, as compared to unfluoridated, there was a 10% increase in cancer. This was a criticized study, so they repeated it, and they did all cities east of the Mississippi, above 10,000 population, comparing fluoridated and unfluoridated. Now, what they did, they compared the cancer statistics before fluoridation and then 13 to 17 years after fluoridation. Again, they found there was a 10% increase cancer death incidence in the cities that had been fluoridated. Now, when you say cancer death incidence, that means people who died of cancer. You can appreciate there's going to be a lot more people who develop cancer who didn't die. So the actual cancer incidence is much higher. This study was so impressive to some members of Congress, they ordered a study of this link to cancer through the Battelle Research Institute. These studies showed that, number one, it produced a number of types of cancer, one which was a very rare liver cancer, and it significantly increased the growth of cancer in people who already had cancers. Well, despite these studies, they're still fluoridating water. They found out it increased fractures, not only in the elderly, but in younger women. And it increased hip fractures in older men to a greater extent than the women. Well, a hip fracture in someone over 65 has a high mortality rate. So it's a good way, if you wanted to increase the mortality of the elderly and get them out of the way, which is in discussion today. We know that it has profound effects on the brain. The fluoride produced two main effects. If you fed the fluoride to a pregnant animal, the offspring then became hyperactive. In other words, like ADHD. If you gave the fluoride after birth, the animal became very lethargic, sort of like a couch potato, didn't really want to do anything, became very apathetic acting. So this was a very clear effect with objective, computerized evaluation of the behavior of these animals. She used over 500 animals. She completed this research, and she also measured the fluoride levels in the animal's brain and found some very interesting things. It's that fluoride tends to accumulate in the part of the brain that controls behavior, particularly the hippocampus and the other limbic areas of the brain. A wide audience of scientists began to look at this research, which for the first time proved that fluoride added to water in the concentrations that humans are exposed to was producing profound changes in the brain and altering behavior of young animals exposed to it. We have to realize at the time women were adding fluoridated water to reconstitute the baby food. Well, over half of babies get reconstituted baby food. They're not breastfed. So this was tens of millions of babies were being exposed to concentrations of fluoride that were used in this experiment. Number one, we know that there's numerous health effects of adding fluoride to water. We know fluoride bioaccumulates in the human body. That means it just keeps getting higher and higher concentrations the more you drink water. If you want to produce the highest concentration of a mineral, you don't put it in the food, you put it in the water, because people drink a lot of water, particularly in warmer climates. So that produces the highest level of bioaccumulation, and that's what we were seeing. Well, Dr. Yamayanis did some studies and looked at the different tissues in the body, found out the highest accumulation was in the thyroid gland. It had been known that one way to reduce thyroid function was to put fluoride in the water, that it produced a significant hypothyroidism, or low function of the thyroid gland. Now, not only does that produce lethargy, apathy, weakness, tiredness in adults, but if you do it in pregnant women, the babies are born with low IQs and they never recover. So even mild reduction of thyroid function in pregnant women has now been shown to produce significant neurobehavioral problems in their offspring. So we've got some rather profound problems with fluoridation that are now well documented from laboratories all over the world without any question. For instance, one of them Dr. Varner did out of Europe, in which he looked at 0.5 parts per million, which is half of what's put in water, and found significant death of neurons in the brain and damage to the blood vessels that supply blood to the brain. He's a highly regarded researcher. It was published in a very prestigious neurological journal. So we have all of these studies proving that this is a very hazardous thing to do, that it produces behavioral changes, many of which we're seeing in the populations that are drinking fluoridated water. We know it bioaccumulates, it gets worse over time. We know that it's absorbed into the plants and the foods, and the concentration in the foods is rising significantly. Yet we have a government that is still pushing as hard as they can, using taxpayer money, to get all the water supply in the United States fluoridated. So I leave it to the audience to think for themselves, what could possibly be the justification for doing such a thing? If you've demonstrated it doesn't reach its objective, that is reducing cavities, which everybody now has admitted, even the ADA has had to admit it, why is it still being added to the water? If it has these profound health effects, why is it still being added to the water? And even the ADA had to admit recently that it is harmful to the baby's brain, and they put out a warning. Now, this is just on the government sites and on their own site. Women should not reconstitute their baby food with tap water that's fluoridated. Well, you don't see that as a headline in your newspaper. You don't see it on most major news TV stories, which would reach most women. It's just sort of kept under the cover so they can say, well, we did put out the warning. We just didn't make it a widespread warning. So a lot of women are still reconstituting their baby's infant formula with fluoridated tap water that even the ADA now admits is harmful to their brains.